Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this debate on media freedom, media restriction, and media responsibility. I'm very grateful to the organizers of the event to have allowed this panel to take place. I would like to express my thanks to the chief organizer of the event, Mr. Jean-Louis Laurence, and the many people behind the scenes who have made this possible. I would like to express my thanks also to Melissa Eddy of the International Herald Tribune, who will be moderating this session for you today. This session hopefully will bring about debate. You are encouraged to join our debate, to raise your voices, and also to do this online. You will see the online invitation to tweet and to invite your followers to tweet and to participate in the debate on the screens where you will have the exact Twitter feed and address for this event. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to Melissa and wish you all the best for an interesting discussion, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Dan. And thank you to all of the organizers. As Dan said, I think he covered all of our thank you. Thank you, all of you, for coming. We look forward to your participation, to your questions. We have with us a very distinguished panel here, and I'm going to, instead of introducing them all in one go, we're just going to introduce them before a question, and we're going to go ahead right now and get started. With those of you who've been following the conference already, the woman on my left needs almost no introduction, but we have Mrs. Trakhal Kaman from Yemen, a Nobel Peace Prize winner from 2011, and she was very active in bringing about a revolution in Yemen, which began, interestingly, not necessarily as we think of what we now call the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening revolutions, as an online or social media, but it began initially the old-fashioned way for those of us who are still involved in old-fashioned media, with pamphlets and radio, and it developed into something more. And so my question to you is, could you tell us what role do you see that those two elements of media playing in bringing about change, in supporting a democracy? Is social media necessarily more effective? Do we need it more? Is traditional media suffering because of social media? How do you see their abilities to help bring about change in democracy?
Thank you so much. في الحقيقة,
in fact, I believe that the media in general are an essential vehicle for liberation, emancipation of people. It is the most efficient way of refusing despotism, of claiming freedom, and of achieving democratic change. There can be no democracy without the backbone that are the media, freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. These media that you referred to, in other words, the traditional media on the one hand and the social media on the other, well, those media are based on the same idea, the same concepts, in other words, the right to expression, but at the same time, freedom of movement. In other words, the right to use events or peaceful demonstrations to convey ideas. Today, we see the advent of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and before that, there were fora. Before blogs, there were fora. Basically, what we did was to use everything that was available in Yemen, way before the Arab Spring revolutions. And in fact, we used those media in a very simple way. The written press, the newspapers, we used, but we also used another means which used to be the monopoly of the army, in other words, text messages, SMS. In the past, we were not allowed to send SMS or text messages, and only the army could use text messages. And in fact, the newspaper that depended on the army, the newspaper of the 26th of September, that was owned by the family of Ali Abdullah Saleh, no one from Yemen could use that type of text messaging in order to convey ideas. You could not send or convey information through text messages, and I don't even mention other media. We had no access to other more traditional media. So what did we do? We were able to rely on information services through text messaging. At one point, we managed to have access to text messaging, and my body, Journalists Without Borders in Yemen, basically used that kind of service and was able to send out information by text message and send it out to some 100,000 people. It was a great step for us. Of course, the regime of Saleh was quite mad at that, and we were threatened on 2 occasions very seriously. Basically, what is important is the right for men and women to receive information. In other words, the right of access to information. You cannot take an active part in society if you're not informed. Once you get that information, once the information arrives, be it through text messages or through television channels, for instance. And in fact, I would like to mention that Al Jazeera played a very interesting and very active role, because that channel completely changed the way in which Arab information channels operated. It changed the whole idea. Up to that point, up to the point where Al Jazeera appeared, the sole aim of TV channels was to present programs that basically allowed people to forget the hardship of life and to think of something else. It really was there as pure entertainment. But when Al Jazeera appeared, everything changed. And I believe that that has actively contributed to improving the level of communication among the people. Let me take the example of Tunisia. In Tunisia, you simply could not get together. You could not assemble. As long as there were more than 3 people, it was banned. But thanks to the social media, thanks to Facebook, thanks to Twitter, these people, at long last, had an outlet. They could express ideas, dreams, and they could assemble. So that means was lacking in a way. And when Twitter, Facebook appeared, then we were able to use it. Now, the situation in Yemen is different. Before the revolution, we, of course, relied on text messaging, as I explained, in 2006 and between 2006 and 2009. And in 2007, in particular, every Tuesday, we would send out messages calling on all those receiving these messages to meet on a square. We called it Freedom Square, and we got together for freedom of expression. And we also defended the right of people, of individuals, to own the media. It was something that was very difficult to achieve in Yemen, and we wanted to prepare the ground in the way, prepare the ground for the revolution of the 14th of January 2011.
So there was also the use of media to facilitate not just the freedom of expression, as facilitating freedom of assembly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We really used many media to assemble before the Jasmine Revolution, the Tunisian Revolution. We used traditional media, but when the revolution started in Tunisia, we also started using Facebook and Twitter increasingly, and my friends throughout the world would say, Tawakkol, your revolution is going to fail. It's going to fail because you have 50% of your population that is illiterate. You do not use Facebook and Twitter, and therefore it is going to be impossible for you to achieve in your revolution contrary to Tunisia and Egypt. And I replied by saying, but you don't need Facebook and Twitter to get a revolution to be successful. You have to take to the streets, and people will meet and gather around us. But it is true that these social media were useful. But both types of media were useful, traditional and Facebook and Twitter. But I would like to add something. Facebook and Twitter played a role afterwards, after the regime collapsed, or after the people took to the streets, because we invited young people, students, because they're the ones who use Facebook and Twitter mainly, so we urged the young people to go out in the streets. And the users of Internet, Facebook and Twitter is probably that the numbers are not as high as in Egypt and Tunisia, but thanks to those social media as well, we were able to fill those public squares, freedom squares, as I called them. And that's how these people gathered on those squares and were able to disseminate their message from those public squares. And many people on those squares actually learned to use Facebook and Twitter. It was quite an extraordinary experience, even after Saleh's regime collapsed. So these social media for us in Yemen, they were important after the revolution, not prior to the revolution. And they certainly did play a fundamental role in all the revolutions of the Arab Spring.
That's also an interesting idea of how social media can continue to play a role in developing democracies. Thank you very much. On my right, we'll shift to another part of the world, to Azerbaijan, where there's also been a transformation of media, the same shift that is taking places in other parts of the world, but not always, in many parts of the world with the same challenges. And I was wondering if you could tell me, Anuya, what do you see as the role of international institutions that they can play in helping ensure the freedom of democracy, the freedom of expression, and perhaps even helping to protect journalists as this shift is taking place? And I know you've had some very personal experience that relates to that.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting moving from Middle East to Azerbaijan. Yes, the topic of today's discussions is, as we know, media responsibility in democratic community. But if we look at participants and speakers of today's panel and generally our meeting, it would be appropriate to call our panel as media responsibility in non-democratic community, of course. I don't mean the representative of Facebook or my neighbor, which protect our rights in Azerbaijan and our neighbor country. It's why? Because it's very hard for me to judge about media's responsibility in democratic societies, since I have never lived in such society. But as a man who has lived several decades in non-democratic society, and as a journalist who has devoted his life generally to the basic mission of journalism, I mean, to tell the truth of current developments in the country, I can share my views on media responsibility, but not in democratic country, in a non-free society. You know, it's very difficult to imagine how a journalist works in non-democratic country, where state bodies' activity is not transparent and where the corruption has turned from problem into system. because, for example, in our country, the corruption as a maybe pyramids of power, it's not problem, it's general system. And in other words, I'm confident that a Western journalist, for example, you will be in no position to work under our circumstances. He will, for example, he will hardly say a truth, risking his freedom or even life. The Western journalists be able to carry on a journalist inquiry for all state and private structures. But as you know, we have the free market economy, not that even the private sector in our country is under state control too. And that's why a decline from commenting information and collaborating with journalists, not to mention the collaboration with media. In our country, the commercial information is conferred the same status as the state secret. And unfortunately, after the last change in our legislation and the Council of Europe declared with the special declaration statement after this, to my mind, conservative change.
And when was that?
It was approximately five months ago.
5 months ago.
Yes. In other words, if a journalist in our country has information about the certain commercial companies belonging to a state servant, he has no right to verify or refute the fact. Since under the current legislation, a commercial company may decline from providing information about an owner of the company. How can a journalist continue his professional activity or the professional investigative research in such circumstances? That's the question. Account has to be taken of the fact that if your activity is disapproved by the government, if you, in the opinion of the powers that has exceeded your authority in permissible criticism of the government, you may be arrested or charged with the most absurd accusations. So let's, for example, I can talk about my experience, starting from drug addiction to hooliganism, from terrorism to xenophobia. You risk being attacked at night in your doorway, stabbed or shot down. That's our reality.
And just quickly, for those in the audience who don't, what were you writing at that time and for which publication when these charges were brought against you?
Just a reflection about what's happened in our country. I mean, the activity of officials. I mean, we described the corruptional system and what happened. Just the post-Soviet area reality, maybe. And
that was, sorry to interrupt, but just to be clear, that was for a newspaper at the time?
I am.
When you were arrested, you were working,
yes.
you were writing,
yes.
reporting for a newspaper.
Yes, sure. Only from a newspaper, and that's why I would like to maybe describe the process of transition from traditional national media to social nets and development of the Facebook and social nets in our country, which now is playing the role of the maybe traditional media. Mm-hmm. For example, for this reason, professional journalists is actually dying out in our country. Nobody is eager to become a journalist and risk his freedom and life. This profession is becoming utterly unpopular already due to its extraordinary responsibility.
Even amongst young people.
Yes, sure, and that's why the new generation, the new young people already moved to the internet, and now we observe the process of the creation, the new media formation, including the new generation and the traditional journalists too, which already the internet, the Facebook already involve the traditional media as maybe already part of the general network.
And how?
Why? Because we have no opportunity to express our point of view in the paper. And it's very interesting that in the public mind and the mind of officials, the real mass media only reflect in the paper, not in the internet. They couldn't maybe receive the internet as the new mass media. They thought maybe that it's a different mechanism.
So it's the young people who are mostly receiving the internet and the messages coming through.
Yes, and to my mind, the experience of the Middle East and the Arabic countries demonstrate not only for example, for our country, but generally for the world, that it is a new, maybe chance, new opportunity for change of the public mind, the change the maybe public opinion in our country, and maybe challenge of new time.
And the question then would be, you've explained the media and how they have responded. The next question would be how the government, which is used to having a certain level of control over the media, if I understand you, how they have responded to Facebook. And you were saying earlier that Facebook has become the most popular media in Azerbaijan.
Yes, approximately now above the million people in Azerbaijan use the Facebook, and the journalists, the famous journalists which criticize the policy of government, already created the newspapers include the Facebook. It's very interesting, yes, and the people, the protest electorate, social base, for example, of opposition, who couldn't, for example, receive the objective information from TV channel, which already we understood it captured by the government, understand that these people can receive the objective information, the real information, only from the Facebook and social networks.
Okay.
It's a new mainstream and new tendency, for example, in our political life.
Which I think it is also in many parts of the world, but with everything new, it raises questions of new responsibilities, and certainly poses new challenges, not only to those who are using, but certainly to those governments, and therefore the impact that it can have on democracies is obviously tremendous. We have with us a representative from Facebook, Elizabeth Lindner, who is on my far left, who deals with governments as a liaison between Facebook and various governments. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about what are some of those challenges that governments view in the rise of social media, and how are they looking to use it to their advantage, but how at the same time perhaps do they feel threatened?
Yes, absolutely. It's fascinating to be at the heart of so many of these conversations, meeting with government agencies and officials across the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region who are grappling with, as you aptly said, both the opportunity that this presents, but also the massive challenges because it all is so new. And there's a question of how do you actually go about training your staff and working as a government towards adapting to this. I'm going to begin by taking us to a source that might seem somewhat out of place in a social media conversation from a Facebook representative. And that's a historian and a deep sea archaeologist, Professor Hale, who has traced the histories of the rise and fall of civilizations in the context of civilizations where their leaders and their governments are willing to open themselves up for counsel amongst the people versus cordon themselves off to come up with their own solutions on their own. And of course, the thesis of all of this to many of us will be quite obvious, which is that the more successful civilizations over time are the ones that involve more inclusive policies that open themselves up to people's opinions and ideas. In fact, the theory goes that the Athenian religion would have lasted at least another couple hundred years had they actually opened up more temples to allow people in. Because in sectioning people off, you create a distance, and of course that creates curiosity, which leads to unrest, which can lead to revolution or finding new alternatives. So all of this is to say that what I find so fascinating about these conversations with government officials is that where do they take this, where they both embrace it without scaring people? In established democracies, our conversations are often about rules that are currently in place. How do you take rules that you've trained your staff in for decades and change them in such a way that they make sense in the 21st century while still holding true to the values that underpin those rules? So, for example, staff members will be trained at the European Commission as to which exact responses they can use when they pick up the phone and talk to citizens. How do those rules apply when you're running a Facebook page and you have the like button in front of you and you have comments? How do you allow for more free flow of information while still ensuring that you're getting people accurate information? The other question is the theory of the expectations gap. When people are using sites like Facebook and other social media sites to come up with their own solutions for what governments and societies can do for them, how do you insert yourself into that conversation to help be part of that conversation? Again, without scaring people by feeling that you're monitoring or watching them. This is especially true for countries with a history of monitoring their people, where newer democracies are trying to say, no, that's not us. We're trying to be helpful, we're trying to involve ourselves in these conversations, and we want to do that effectively. We have to be there, but then we don't want to scare people by being in these forums. And I find that a particularly fascinating debate. I think the final document I would actually point to, if some people in the room maybe haven't seen it, is called the Budva Declaration. And this is a group of southeastern European countries that got together, communications managers, to discuss the principles that will underpin their communications strategies.
Just real quickly, are they from government or are they from the private sector?
Absolutely. They're from the central government. Okay. Of all of the southeastern European countries, some members of the EU, some not, some like Montenegro, which have already started the process of joining. And this document underlines these principles for saying, here's how we as government communicators are going to see, how it is that we reach citizens in today's world. What's fascinating to me is in many ways it's far more advanced than in more established democracies, because they're taking this massive leap from communications 1.0 to 3.0, if you will, and yet it's also very experimental. So of course it just was passed in September of this year, so it's completely new. So lots of challenges, lots of conversations, but what encourages me most is that the conversations are happening. I have yet to encounter anybody in a government, whether a democracy or not a democracy, who doesn't even want to have the conversation. Everyone's willing to have the conversation. The question is how far those challenges are going to be met in the coming years.
Although one could also ask the question, in this day and age, can you afford not to have the conversation? Mm-hmm. Whether you want to or not, it's almost become a force that forces you to have that conversation, which for democracy could be beneficial. By certainly, it's sort of what you were speaking about, of how the democracy that social media came afterwards and was playing the role in building. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll move right on to your neighbor, which brings us to we've spoken now about the role of governments and media with freedom of expression. There's also been recently very clear examples of the role of religion and freedom of expression in religion, and differing understandings of how far is too far, who controls the conversation, and what role does social media play and the media in general, freedom of expression, play for us in this conversation. And Mr. Moaz Massoud from Egypt is a religious leader and an activist with 1.4 million followers on Facebook. Is that correct? So you can see the power there. Perhaps you could talk to us about that idea, the role of religion and freedom of expression. How can media, how can the public discussion facilitate trying to shape ideas and limitations and acceptance, understanding of the role that religion plays or the role that social media plays in talking about religion, and where do we draw the lines of freedom of expression? What is free? What one person's free speech may be another person's severe offense.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I think, Melissa, we need to go back to philosophy again, kind of, sort of like what my colleague just did. We need to pull out and look at a big picture. I will quote Immanuel Kant, who anticipated that with globalization approaching, what we now call that, through the technological revolutions with both communications and transport, many people are seeing cultures that they'd never imagined ever seeing before. We do live in unique times when we kind of look kind of historically at this unique time we live in. And we don't really have a precedent for how to deal multiculturally yet. And so it's normal for us to go through a trial and error phase, and for one culture to unintentionally impose its own view on another one with all good intent, and for another culture to unfortunately react, violently as because you've touched its most sacred part, etc. And to see the kind of struggle that we're going through, I just want to say that, as Immanuel Kant said, the reaction to globalization would be that people would hurtle back into their ideological caves. People would hold on to ideas because they need to protect themselves. And so this is very normal, and that's how people feel safe. And people's identity, really, according to many social psychologists, is their meaning system. It's how they make sense of the world. So when we bear this in mind, I think it's important to, in a kind of disciplined honesty, as some academics would say that is what academia is, a disciplined honesty, to very sincerely and in a non-reductionistic manner try to understand. Each person from every culture should really try to understand the departure points of the person on the other side. This is a very healthy exercise. It's also pragmatically a very necessary exercise today. And to tie that to the media, our first speaker, the Nobel laureate, said she spoke in Arabic, and so she used the word i'lam, which is the Arabic word for media. Etymologically, i'lam means to make know, to inform. I'lam. Its antonym would be ijhal, which would be to cause to remain ignorant or to cause to be ignorant. And so at the essence of the understanding for media, at least in the Arabic language, is this idea of not misinforming and not misleading. And misinformation and misleading doesn't just have to be verbal. It can also be done through selective bias, intended or unintended, through highlighting certain aspects of a quarrel, humanizing certain aspects and dehumanizing others, of inserting unintentionally one's own narrative in the reporting of news or the formation of talk shows or whatever else. I'm obviously talking about television a little bit more here, because television and then also photojournalism has a lot, is playing a huge role in the shaping of our perceptions of one another in the world today. Now, media in English, etymologically, is a bit more neutral. It's like kind of like a medium, it's a plural of medium, it's a vehicle. And you could see how when television, being again mass media, came out, you had people who protested against it. I would never have taken their side back in their day, but I'd like to understand their departure points. And their idea was the medium is the message. They were worried that it would be used to misinform and to mislead, as Fox, for example, will sometimes do, or I don't know who in Egypt, so-and-so, Tawfiq Okasha, for Egyptians who know him, or other individuals who will come up and lie or kind of misrepresent. And so to link media with multiculturalism, which I think is necessary for universalizing democracy. You can't really universalize democracy without it being truly multicultural, is to sincerely implore the media, which is made of individuals in the end who control it, to be disciplined, to have disciplined honesty, and to not be reductionistic when they portray a people and their struggle for freedom or whatever else. One of the things that I find constantly misportrayed in the media is, in this case, I'm almost sure, hopefully unintentional, this is not judging here, but we have to tell facts as they are. This selective bias in not highlighting the real debate that's going on within, for example, the Muslim world. Not the Arab world, but the Muslim world. There is a real debate going on between what we can call normative Islamic interpretations that have a traditional core to them, that are very multiculturalist, that are all about the Quranic notion of ta'aruf, of people all being one species and yet having all these variations within them to complete each other, to know each other, to learn about each other, not to change each other or convert each other or Arabize each other, as the other interpretation would like to do, which is what you can call the heterodoxical extremist interpretation, which is, of course, battling with the normative interpretation of Islam. But whenever I'm abroad, the impression my foreign colleagues always seem to have is that it's either Islam or secularity. But that's not true. In fact, I was so convinced that was not true, I wrote an entire thesis about it. Just to highlight, again, academically, the point. The point is, I'll conclude.
No, it's fine. I was just, if you'll allow me to interject
Of course.
for a minute, in a discussion with the Secretary General, and I think it was also mentioned yesterday in the opening remarks, for years there was sectarian violence in Northern Ireland, and nobody called it Christian terrorism. And yet the violence in the Arab world or in other, where it involves Muslim, is Islamic terrorism. And the danger of the use of combining that idea of that one word, how it completely shifts our understanding of who is actually behind the violence or the reason behind the violence.
It completely does, because at the end of the day, very few people will sit and filter what is going through their information processing system and ultimately shapes their perception of the world. I was just commenting earlier, as the philosopher Mary Midgley said, facts are not gathered in a vacuum. And this is a philosophically coherent idea. We gather facts and unconsciously complete an already existing world picture. And I think that the world picture that is being depicted by the media everywhere, I'm talking about my country as well, and I'm talking about, the West, everything really globally, is not the constructive world picture and not the accurate one either. I had to comment on recent events with the film and then the cartoons and these things that happened very recently on television just a few days ago, live television, which, you can't edit. And you had a caller came in and talked about the West as a monolithic entity, which really frustrates me because it's not true. But had I not intervened, it would have gone by, and I risked ruining the episode from the perspective of the host by angrily stopping and saying, as someone who felt responsibility, as a media person, I'm sorry, I can't accept this conspiratorial tone. And then I looked at the host, and this was obviously a religious context kind of episode because it involved the Prophet Muhammad, alayhi salatu wasalam, as we say. And I just looked at the host, and I had to say it 3 times, and I had to hope and pray that I don't be labeled an American agent for saying what I believe to be the truth, even if it coincided with what an American would want. It still was the truth. And I just looked at him and I said, Sayyidina Muhammad la yu'ammim. Sayyidina Muhammad la yu'ammim. 3 times, Sayyidina Muhammad la yu'ammim. The Prophet Muhammad does not generalize. The Prophet Muhammad does not generalize. And you'd be surprised at the tons of emails and tweets from people who that was a paradigm shift for. That can be done through the media. Now, there's much more to be said, but to conclude this first intervention, I would say that it is important for the media, again globally, to understand that there's a difference between secularism and secularity. And that there is part of the frustration, that's not my phone, is it? No, they're off. Part of the frustration of Arabs when, as we were hearing earlier, change is being mentioned, is that we are truly trying to get into a post-colonialist era now. We really are. We really don't want someone to dictate upon us how we're supposed to be. We know we have problems. We know that we haven't yet come up with a recognizably ethical alternative to secular liberal democracy that we can say is our own functioning model. So that's a question that I pose to Arabs, but then I must pose to the other side, really, again, not to generalize, but to continents that, adopt secular liberal democracy. Europe, North America, by and large, with varying interpretations. When I'm asked, and when I was just recently asked, can Islam tolerate liberalism, I would explain how certain interpretations of Islam will, yes, be coherent with almost every interpretation of with many, many, many aspects of more modern interpretations of liberalism. But then I turned the table around and asked, can liberalism tolerate anything other than itself? Can liberalism tolerate difference? I think this question is key for the question of universalizing democracy, the question of multiculturalism, and the role of the media within it. There is serious reason to find a hopefully unintentional yet existent intolerance of difference when it comes to certain legislations, when it comes to citizenship tests, for example, with some conspicuous questions, say in Germany or other places. What do you think of a woman appearing in public without a male relative? I mean, a European couldn't even understand that question. That's clearly geared towards a Muslim. Questions of that sort. And so it is time to, in the media as well, start asking these very sincere questions with the hope of truly arriving at democracy in the sense of it being a universal value. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you touched on one very important and interesting issue, which I think we could say is that of accountability. The idea of the media, as we say, needs to be accountable, but the media is also changing, where at one time organizations had an editorial board, people who made decisions, and people who then took the responsibility for those decisions. As we shift into social media, who is accountable and who is being held accountable? And in many cases, it is groups like the Council of Europe, or also groups like that which Gillian York, here on my right, is active in, that hold social media and these companies accountable. And Gillian, perhaps you could jump into the conversation for us here and talk about the role of accountability. Who is holding these media groups, these new media groups, accountable? And what role are they being given, or perhaps even the small board, as we call them, of people who don't know, who do not have a philosopher's in-depth understanding of Islam, such as you do, and are not consulting on that, yet are making these decisions?
Sure. So I'm going to step back for just a moment, but I promise that I will get to that question. I was just fascinated by what my colleague, Mr. Masood, was just saying. And one of the things that I think is missing a lot of times, particularly in the discussions about the incidents that have happened recently around cartoons and a very, in my opinion, offensive video made about the Prophet, And that discussion is the difference between responsibility, individual responsibility and respect, versus legality. So what we should be doing versus what should be allowed. And I have to say that in terms of what we should be doing, I think that we would probably be in absolute agreement in that, as I said, I found that particular video, I think we all know the one I'm referring to, I found it to be offensive as a non-Muslim. I watched the trailer that was on YouTube and I thought, honestly, frankly, what an idiot that created this. Why would someone do something like this for the sheer motivation of provocation? But on the other hand, when we look at what should be allowed, I had written an article that same week for CNN arguing that, yes, this does fall under protected speech, in my country at least. This should be allowed to remain up, and we should not censor it. And I want to talk just briefly about why. So I think I've got 3 main points as to why a company or a government should not censor that type of speech. And in this case, we're talking about blasphemy and hate speech. My arguments are, first, I think that censorship is inherently ineffective, particularly when we're talking about the internet. So in this case, we had a number of governments that either called upon YouTube by court order to block the video, or we had some governments, such as that of Afghanistan, which blocked YouTube on their own. And this was very ineffective for a number of reasons. For one, in Egypt at least, the video was shown on television, so the internet at first had nothing to do with it. There's also the fact that YouTube is not merely the only platform that exists, and in fact we have video sharing platforms that are based in other governments, in other jurisdictions, that did not take the same action, and so if you really wanted to see it, it was available for you. My second point would be a phenomenon known as the Streisand effect, and I'm guessing people are not familiar with it, so I'll try to briefly explain. The actress and singer Barbra Streisand, several years ago, her private home was photographed by a paparazzi, and she tried to get an injunction to forbid that photograph from being printed. As a result, that photograph ended up everywhere on the internet, and she ended up having this effect named after her. And so the idea is that when you censor something, that thing proliferates even more than it would have otherwise. My third point is basically that
we're getting agreement from here elsewhere on the panel on that idea. Okay.
And I think that's what we saw recently with this particular video as well, that had the Egyptian television station not shown it, you wouldn't have had riots in Egypt because no one cared. It was a tiny, not even B grade, I would call it Z grade video, very terrible. And I think my third point, and this comes up a lot when we talk about illegal things on the internet, such as child sexual abuse images, when you block it, so there are several governments in Europe that merely block child pornography. They also try to go after it, but they block it so that you can't see it. That's simply hiding it from my eyes. And sure, I don't want to accidentally stumble across that type of content. And it's definitely legal. We should definitely be going after these people with the full force of the law. However, merely blocking it does not solve the problem. It's putting a Band-Aid on a wound rather than healing the wound. And I think that the solution there is not to censor, because censorship merely pushes it underground, below the surface. Instead, by allowing it to be open, I know it's a horrible idea in some ways, it makes it easier for law enforcement to go after it. And so when we're talking about truly illegal things, I think that's the case. But to your point...
Well, but you've given me a great, and because I'm looking at my watch here, but talking about censorship, if I may, I'm going to just move right on to your neighbor, because censorship feeds into something that I think from Turkey, that Kadri Gürsel, who is a columnist from Iliad, can talk about, because censorship, even in traditional media, without even the idea of the internet as well, has been an issue. And perhaps you could talk about the role of censorship, and how do you see, as a journalist, the role of government? Do we need it more hands-on? Do we need it more hands-off? And how does that play out?
Well, thank you very much, but our problem in Turkey is not typical classical censorship, it's self-censorship, and it hurts very badly. And it's a huge, I think, huge question that we need to tackle. And with fired journalists, jailed journalists. The third question that we have, I think, limiting the press freedom in Turkey is the self-censorship, and it's the result of a power struggle between the new ruling elites and the old one.
And do you mean that politically, the elites, or journalistically? In terms
politically,
of politically.
But it affected the media environment in Turkey, definitely. Well, when I got the invitation to speak to this panel, I've come here with a written text in my pocket, so I will read it partially at least. And a remarkable question in the invitation letter struck me. It was as follows: how should governments and international organizations protect media freedom, hands-off or hands-on? Well, I will bring my local perspective, which means the perspective of the country where I've come from. This dilemma is very catchy. Dealing with it is unavoidable, so I was took hostage of this dilemma. I think we media professionals, in stories we write, we say what we should say in the lead. So I will say what I need to say in the lead, and you don't wait until the end. But and obviously many of you would guess my answer. But before hearing from me, let's try to approach the dilemma from a different angle. Imagine that here on my chair, where I'm sitting right now, a Turkish government official or Turkish ruling party politician sat and gave his or her own answer to the same question of the same dilemma. Hands-on or hands-off, what would his or her answer be? It's easy to guess also. He or she would choose to say hands-off, obviously. He or she would say, don't interfere, if you do so, it will backlash, let local dynamics do their work, putting pressure on Turkey for anything would be counterproductive, etc. Then my answer becomes clear. It is yes, indeed, hands-on. I want to see more and more hands on Turkey's press freedom problem. As a press freedom activist, additional to my professional journalism, I am also, in my country, the chairman of the IPI's National Committee. So, let me explain why hands-on approach in Turkey helped so far and will help in the future.
Moving ahead.
Today, yes. Well, first of all, Turkish government is not immune to international criticism like oil-rich states, for example, are. They don't have any immunity to criticism because the new elite, the political elite and the government and the new conservative entrepreneurial classes politically supporting this government are vulnerable to criticism. They care about their own image in the world, even if they don't about the standards of press freedom at home. This is their paradoxical situation. They, let me use this word, the soft belly of Turkish government limiting press freedom by using many different methods is the image. Is his image in the world. So Turkey's new rulers are not isolationists. They are more connected to the world. The entrepreneurial class, the Anatolian bourgeoisie, they call, wants to do business all around the world. They wanted to be recognized, respected. They were after legitimacy and recognition, and they got it. And now they have to protect it. And it's how, in this context, the image factor works, enters into equation. And they are more aware, the new rulers are more aware than the previous ones that press freedom is among the most venerated in the set of international values bringing together the family of democratic nations. So this makes them conscious about the benefits of the fact that the country they rule being considered by others as democratic one. Being less democratic means having less soft power, having less freedom of the press, means for them having less legitimacy, less prestige. This image concern helped so far in reducing the number of journalists in jail. It was about 100 a year ago. Now it's around 80 and maybe less. And thanks to the pressure from the outside,
and
from the international community, the famous case of Nedim Şener and Ahmet Şık, for example, you may all know about their misadventures in jail. We got them out of the jail thanks to this international pressure and thanks to this image concern, because it was the most important situation about. Well, the ones who have been released, as I said so far, are the ones for whom international media organizations have campaigned for their freedom. International campaigns plus news stories appeared about jailed journalists in the international media, plus critical declarations of respectable international figures on the issue, all have created a certain awareness in the minds of the new Turkish elite about how their image has become so fragile so far because of the suppression of the press freedom in the country they rule. One dimension to add to the image problem, we need hands-on our press freedom issue, because local dynamics in our country is historically and traditionally weak. That's why I think we need more and more hands-on the endemic Turkish press freedom problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that brings us to our last speaker, and then we will be opening it up for questions. Looking at the case of Syria, where, again, I have someone here who doesn't need a whole lot of introduction, Ali Farzad. Perhaps you could talk to us about the idea of how has the ability to project what the situation in Syria to the outer world been able to come back and shape developments in your country and that wider freedom of expression, the impact that you see that as having had or failing to have had on the situation of democracy in Syria today?
أعتقد إن ما نراه الآن على الساحة السورية ليس هو نتاج سنة أو سنتين أو يوم أو يومين، إنه نتاج 50 عاما من الدكتاتورية. 50 عاما من الدكتاتورية قد أسست جمهورية خاصة بها وليست كبقية الجمهوريات الكلاسيكية المعروفة.
One second, we have problems with our translation. Are you able to get the Arabic translation?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Then I'm going to come back to you, but while they're sorting this out, I don't want to waste our time. So perhaps we could take a first question. We have some very eager hands out there. We're going to start actually with the very first question from Twitter, and then you in the audience, I will come back to you. Do we have a... Okay, we don't have one right now. Number 59. If I could ask you, we're looking at tight time. Keep it to a question, please.
Okay. I just want to know where do you see the role of the correspondence? Because I think, for example, in Egypt, during the revolution, there was euphorical ethical way of the reporting from the journalists, and I'm not sure if it is good to be subjective. When is it okay to be subjective in reporting as a correspondent?
Do you have that, the question to anyone in particular, or just?
No, anyone who wants to answer.
Anyone who wants to answer, okay.
The representative of Egypt.
Yes, I was going to say, because
A journalistic question.
a journalistic question.
Yeah, I mean, Egypt. I can, if you want, I can.
If you,
It will be because it's a reality of the Middle East. It will be maybe too easy, yes, to
Maybe
answer.
we can throw the question back at you. What do you mean by subjective?
if I understand it right, the idea of, you were speaking about avoiding bringing in too much bias and the need for objective reporting, for one to be fair and balanced. And what role you think in the day of social media, when you can get voices from everywhere, do journalists still carry this responsibility to objectivity, and to what extent does that play a role in the media dialogue?
I just have a very brief answer. I think that absolute objectivity is a myth, philosophically speaking, and it's never going to exist. In fact, the comment I made earlier about Mary Midgley's point about facts not being gathered in a vacuum, but rather to unconsciously complete an already existing world picture, holds for your question. However, I think that on an individual level, a correspondent, journalist, host, whatever the individual does for a living, needs to be constantly vigilant about their own biases, so that if they ever catch a bias seeping into their perspective and hence their reporting about an event, that's when they need to consciously shed that. And it's not just catching a bias, but it's also catching a method of reporting that I have now come to recognize will mislead, will misinform.
I think that also brings us into the accountability idea, where with traditional journalists, the idea of accountability does play a role.
No,
You want to comment?
I think that the era of, the time that there is one correspondent is end, because now there is الصحفي المواطن, there is the الصحفي المواطن يعني the citizen journalist. So now all the correspondents around the world, they are observing by these people. So when any correspondent make a mistake, news, there is another journalist, there is another citizen can, observe him and also give يعني الخبر الصحيح, الخبر الصحيح, the truth. The truth. This is number one. What happened? It's the strategy. Sorry, I'm going to speak in Arabic.
You no need to apologize.
Yeah. المشكلة هي تبقى في استراتيجية وسائل الإعلام التي يعني تقوم ببث هذه الأخبار، في السياسات الإعلامية التي تقوم بوسائل الإعلام التي تبث تلك الأخبار المغلوطة. فالمسألة there is no translation. Oh my God. Okay, I think the idea is reached to you. Okay. So now all the correspondent is observing by the الصحفي المواطن, by the citizen journalist.
Maybe in addition to this, just two sentences.
I'm going to go first here and then there.
You see, in Azerbaijan, in last time, we discussed the question how we can maybe shift of responsibility from journalists to the maybe people journalism, and we try to explain to our readers that regretfully our society doesn't realize that we're subject repressions. Where journalists and correspondents subject of repressions, not because of what we have written, said, or shot, but because our society has read, heard, and watched what we represent to its attention. That's why, to my mind, you see, that's why the process of the creation of the new formation of journalism, I mean the people journalism in raise them helped maybe to create the responsibility of civilian society too. Thank you.
Thank you. Gillian?
Yes, I'll make it brief. Oh, it's gone. I think that there's something interesting that I observed from the outside during the Arab Spring, which was that as you had these Western commentators, and I think the best example of this, in my opinion, is Thomas Friedman, you had them saying certain things, and then you were able to watch Twitter react to that. And so, 5 years ago, all of the conferences were about whether citizen media was going to replace traditional media. And I think instead, what we've seen happen is an important ecosystem where they sort of play off of each other. They're both still necessary. Yeah.
I think that's interesting. Yes, of course.
Well,
a good question solicits many answers.
This question of accountability will find at the end of the day it's bad on the new checks and balances of the social media and interaction between the established media or mainstream media, conventional, traditional media, and between the social media, because there's a constant interaction between the social media and the traditional media, and it helps to render the outcome, the news production, more and more accountable to the arbitration of the so-called consumers.
Yes.
Means news consumers.
News consumers.
Because, I think under the new circumstances, a biased story or faked one will not see the day forever, or will not. There will be always some counteraction against, and will settle and solve the issue in natural ways.
To resolve it in the course of
thanks to the social
discussion.
media and interaction.
Okay. Our translation appears still not... It is back up now? Okay. Is it back? I haven't checked.
Yes, it should be possible now for Arabic to be spoken and interpreted into French,
Okay.
English, and Russian.
Yes, we have our translation back again. So, Ali, I am going to shift back to you, because I think your voice is very important, and what is happening in Syria now. But also, in a sense, this question of what role does a correspondent play. In Syria, there has been such a repression of traditional journalists, if you will, allowing them in. It has been through videos that have gotten out that we've seen this. However, you're also a traditional journalist. You've been able to send your message out. Could you just comment for us on what role do you see this playing in the ongoing struggle right now in Syria, this ability for freedom of expression, to get the word out?
حابب أقول شيء كاريكاتوري قبل ما أبدأ بالحديث.
To begin with,
انتقلنا من قمع الأنظمة إلى قمع التكنولوجيا.
I'd like to start out by talking as a drawer of caricatures. We were victims of a technological difficulty, but now we've overcome that, thank God. Now, when the Ba'athist Party took power in Syria more than 50 years ago today, it instilled a republic of fear. And this republic developed in parallel, with many different institutions being put in place in parallel, to create this republic of fear with no civil society and everything being controlled, including, of course, the media, obviously. Now, there were 3 or 4 phases through which any report had to be vetted. I mean, to begin with, self-censorship. Journalists would censor themselves because of the fear. And then the desk director, and then the editor-in-chief of the medium, and then the prime minister, and then the presidential palace. I mean, it was extraordinary. And there were very strict security standards which could be used to censor the article, to censor the journalist himself by putting him in prison. So there was a whole trajectory through which information had to go before it actually reached the public domain. And I cannot, words fail me to describe to you the suffering of journalists who were confronted with these electrified barbed wire fences that they had to negotiate their words through to get them through to their listeners. Now, some journalists, I've experienced all of this personally, some journalists tried to get the information out in just a few lines, just a few words, putting things in between the lines for the intelligent reader. So they tried to get around the problems and the obstacles of censorship, hoping that the intelligent reader would interpret what they had said in the in between the lines way rather than the direct way. And each newspaper, each editor-in-chief had their own way of interpreting what journalists were writing. Now, you must know that in our criminal code, there were some quite extraordinary articles identifying as criminally liable crimes, things that were just in the everyday work of ordinary journalists. It went as far as capital punishment for journalists who transgressed. So Syrian journalists really put their lives on the line in their work. Now, insofar as my own personal experience is concerned, as was said by an American professor who wrote a book on the Republic of Fear, and this professor was so kind as to devote 10 pages to my drawings, to my caricatures. And therein she referred to the Syrian dictatorship under Assad the father of the present Assad. And that was when I started to draw, and so for some 30 years now I have worked in a sort of a Syrian circus. I mean, you have to be a clown to get your information across. You have to be a court jester, if you will. I felt sometimes like I was a tightrope walker. I tried to represent the dictatorship through other personalities. I couldn't draw Assad, I couldn't draw his son. And I think people got the message, nevertheless. They did grasp what I was trying to say, at least many of them. And so I, until about 3 months before the revolution, I really was working in this very strange kind of world, quite an aberration. And then suddenly I felt that no, I have to go beyond the symbolism, the previous symbolism, in order precisely to tear down the barrier of fear. I had to draw them as they really were. Now, cartoonists or caricaturists like me don't use words. We try to find concepts that are common to all of humanity: dignity, freedom, love of the environment, pan-human values, pan-human concepts. And that can be accessible to everyone. And this is what I strove to do. I saw that the street was in rebellion, that the spark had been ignited, and someone needed to break down the barrier of fear so that people would be able to go out into the streets. And after all of those decades of fear, even of terror, I felt that I became a different person, that I became a different cartoonist. Someone came out of my body and started to draw. And I had no choice but to keep going. I had to draw al-Assad as he was, For a whole week, I drew the heads of the security service, and people in my entourage were saying that, oh, I must be crazy. Or maybe and some of them thought that I was a foreign agent. But when they realized that when I was really working for Syrians within Syria, not for any foreign power, then they began to spread my cartoons, even talk about them over the telephone, discuss them in public places, and all of this inspired me to set up an internet site in my own name. It was blocked for a while, but then access was ensured subsequently, and I received an incredible number of comments on my site about the caricatures. I also tried to open up an art gallery because they closed down Donari, the newspaper in which I published my cartoons. They closed it down. And in fact, the name of this publication was the name of the person who would light the lanterns before electricity. So the idea was that you could shed light on the darkness. But they closed that down. They prohibited its publication, and the intelligence services.
3 o'clock, and we need about 10 more minutes for questions. So it's time, unfortunately. Yes, I'm sorry we lost time with the lack of translation, but I'm sure there are questions out there also possibly for you, and I'd like some of those questions to get in, as important as your work is, but also because you have an important message to tell. Again, our first question taker was really great and to the point. We're extremely tight on time. If you can keep your questions short, it gives us time for richer answers. Number 12, right in the front.
What do you think of WikiLeaks in the context of investigative journalism?
The question is, what do we think of WikiLeaks in the context of investigative journalism?
Great. And we need more WikiLeaks. This is one of our rights. Yeah. We need WikiLeaks. It's the right of people to own, to have the information. Without having information, there is no press rights. There is no expression rights. The right of information and transparent.
The access to information that you were saying earlier.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. This is very important. So we need more WikiLeaks. And thanks for the founder of the WikiLeaks. And I think now there is many people around the world, especially in the countries who suffering from corruption, who suffering from dictators. They are now playing the same rule of WikiLeaks through Facebook and through Twitter.
That they've set out a precedent that now is continuing. Gillian, I know you've also done some work on this.
Yes, you know, it's interesting because as an American, whenever I'm asked this question in a formal setting, my heart begins to pound. And I think that that's a very bad sign, because the fact that I fear repercussions for saying the things that I'm about to say means that civil liberties in my country are eroding. And I believe that. So while I think that you know, there were mistakes made with WikiLeaks, and that's another discussion altogether, I do think that whistleblowing in general is an incredibly important thing, and that it needs to happen at all levels, from government to hospitals. I recently read that doctors are afraid of whistleblowing in the US because they fear that it will get them bad hours and, you know, have to work in the emergency room more, things like that, to schools. So I do think that being able to speak up and speak truth to power when you see something bad going on is absolutely imperative.
Okay, great. Young woman in the green scarf here.
Okay, promise I will not do a speech.
Thank you.
I just wanted to bring you the voice of the Youth Assembly that took place this weekend. so please approach us for a wider explanation. But we were working on...
I'm just going to say, the young people who had also a forum, and they have a lot, they came up and approached us. We don't have time for their information, but please come and approach them if you have further questions.
3 points. Talking, of course, we were against censorship of internet. But we were also speaking about implementing e-democracy and e-education to foster democracy. What do you think about this?
And the question to Miss Facebook, how would you, not on the Youth Assembly, but representing myself, how would you reflect on the development of democracy through Facebook, while actually Facebook is contributing to the development of big brother states by violating our privacy rights big time and selling our information to governments and FBI or whatnot? Thank you.
Elizabeth, I think you could ask on both of those, the privacy issue, but also e-democracy, e-education, education also being a key part of access to information.
Yeah, well, what's actually interesting about that connection between how democracy is interrelating, I think, with the social web, is that in the last few years we've had such fascinating dialogue taking place in terms of the way that open government is working. So you have all of your websites and your discussions devoted to how do we take what's going on at the government sphere and opening that up to the public. But what was often missing in that debate was how you actually enable people to discover that content and share that content and respond and react to it. What I'm starting to see, which is encouraging me, is that the debate on how social media relates to government and the debate on how open government relates to government are starting to come together much, much more so.
And on the privacy issue?
On the privacy issue, I mean, we're a private company, and we have terms of use which are very explicit on our site. When content violates those terms of use, we will take it down because we do operate as a private company. It's very explicit and it's very clear. Every user on Facebook has an opportunity to post whatever it is that they want on Facebook, so long as that goes within our terms of use. When content is reported to us, we will determine whether or not that content actually violates our terms of use. And if it does, we will take it down. And if it does not, we will not. Thank you.
Number 160 has a question.
Jean-Pierre Richery.
My name is Jean-Pierre Richery. I'm a member of the International Confederation of Intellectual Workers, which is an NGO associated with the Council of Europe, and I was a journalist during the war in Ethiopia. I'm very delighted today to have heard Arabic spoken, to have heard a lot said about Syria and Yemen. My question is very simple. I hail from Tunisia. I am both Tunisian and French. Do we have the right? I mean, when are we going to stop dictators from putting journalists in prison? Freedom of expression must become a fundamental value for all of humanity. Information must be provided. Citizens must feel free to work in a country for their children, to sell their vegetables, and to obtain information. And when a journalist thinks that something isn't right, be it economic, social, or political, and says so, he must not be put in jail. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We also have a question that has been tweeted that we're going to take from here, and it is to... Have you seen it? Okay. How do the effects of Twitter and Facebook get involved in education schools in Egypt?
Well, I think the expert on that would be Wa'il Ghunim, who I think competed with Tawakkul for the Nobel Prize. So he's quite influential. He founded the Facebook page Kullina Khalid Saeed, which was huge in sharing information about January 25. I think that I would, I don't know how I can, maybe I can actually find that tweet and connect, I forgot his name, with Wael directly, actually, to help him answer that. I don't know if I'm allowed to or not. I have under a 90-second comment to make about something else that was brought up. But again, if questions are more important, questions are more important. Am I allowed?
Keep it brief. But
80 seconds.
80 seconds.
And counting.
Right.
I was just going to comment on Gillian's point, the 3 points actually, which I found fascinating because when it came to freedom of expression, in logic, once you accept premises and then move soundly between them, you can only accept the conclusion. It would be intellectually, you'd be intellectually incriminated for not accepting the conclusions. I think that given her premises, her argument was sound. I think she was also very sincere in her argument. I genuinely think so. I just want to comment that the issue with ridiculing Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is not an issue of freedom of expression at all. I think freedom of expression is a red herring when it comes to ridiculing the Prophet. And the reason is, freedom of expression is non-negotiable. This is something I will stand up for, and if you put it in those terms, then I'm on your side. But then what if I have a different view? And that's when we need to kind of transcend current false dichotomies and start questioning. So for example, Andrew March was it in the New York Times with his article, What's Wrong with Blasphemy? Tried to draw on philosophy to look at the problem and ended up making a good argument. I recommend it, but the part I will quote has to do with relationality. I spoke with the social psychologist recently as well about this, and she started bringing up all these things about social intelligence and emotional intelligence and communication in the collective versus the individual, things I cannot get into, the impact on children, how a child will grow up thinking his society thinks this way if this is condoned of his prophet. I think when you bring those things in, then this is something I would never impose. I could only suggest. I wouldn't care less if there was consistency. The reason a lot of Arabs will take this the way they do, and also Muslims all over the world, there are different reasons. One, it's injurious, obviously, to their sense of self. It's clearly doing something which a secularist may not understand, and I can understand that. Two, and so there's 3 points as well, right? And two, Gillian, is the idea of previous grievances that pile up. They have nothing to do with the cartoon, but they're there. And then three, and lastly, Melissa, is the idea of consistency. Who was it that wrote Hate Speech Hypocrites recently? Especially with Europe. The question of, well, you will curtail somewhere, then why not here? And so maybe the ideal thing is to not censor anything. But the consistency, the inconsistency is offensive.
This brings us up to another part of our discussion that we had, that democracy requires certain rules and regulations in order to function correctly, as would free speech. Okay, Gillian, I'm going to allow you to respond, and then unfortunately we're going to have to close because already we're beyond time.
Okay, I'm going to work on a 30-second response. And that is that I actually completely agree with you, and I think that what it comes down to when we're talking about legality and censorship is that right now we are living in an increasingly globalized world, and the laws about hate speech from Europe, where they deal with a certain group, to other countries where they might deal with a different certain group, are inconsistent. And for me, the response is no censorship at all. And I do think that that is the most consistent response as we move forward. We can't pick and choose which group we treat this way, which group we treat that way. We have to treat all groups similarly. And so we need to encourage and foster individual responsibility and kindness, while at the same time, under the law, allowing whatever speech needs to exist.
I also agree that we don't want any rule to against press freedom or expression rights. نحن لا نريد أي قواعد.
We don't want any rule imposed upon or constraint on the freedom of the press. All we are asking is that the freedoms be unlimited, unconstrained, but at the same time there needs to be a culture of mutual respect, that there be a sense among journalists that they have the responsibility to respect other religions and other cultures. And there's absolutely no reason why that should be in contradiction with the freedom of expression, which is an absolutely fundamental value of democracy. Now, insofar as the cartoons ridiculing the Prophet or the film about the Prophet are concerned, yes, of course, that film was, well, how can I put it? It was simply disgusting. It was disgusting for me, it was disgusting for many peoples, for many nations. And what remains of the former regimes, the Saleh regime, the Mubarak regime, I mean, they instrumentalized this event and they used it to encourage people to demonstrate in a violent manner. Those demonstrations became violent. Now, one has the right also to express oneself through a rally, through a demonstration, through a march, but that was instrumentalized. It went so far as it degenerated into violence, and protesters were in fact paid sums of money to attack embassies, and those who opened up the doors of the American embassy so the demonstrators could enter were from the security service run by the cousins of Saleh. So yes, there must be freedom of expression with no constraints, but at the same time, we must all become imbued with a culture of mutual respect, understanding of the other, and tolerance. Thank you.
Okay. I couldn't agree more, and I think that I want to commend Dick Gordon, for example, from The Story with NPR, who interviewed me, and like Gillian, for a moment there, I thought that whatever I was going to say, half of it was going to go. Right, be censored because it just can't be there. And I mentioned previous grievances. I mentioned Iraq, distorted morality of Palestine and Israel, a whole bunch of things. And I also mentioned that over 90% of respondents to the question of, do you think what was more insulting to the Prophet? What happened in Libya, the unfortunate tragic death of the ambassador, or the cartoons or whatever else that was there? And over 90% said what happened in Libya. And I mentioned that, and he showed that, and that's just the kind of responsibility that I think will bring us towards a more successful multiculturalist world.
I think there's also the idea of what will bring us to a more successful world is opportunities like this to get together, to hold these discussions. I apologize to those of you, I know there were good questions out there that we didn't get to them, but I want to thank all of my panelists for their input and encourage all of them to continue to express themselves in all of their places, their corners of the world. Yeah?
I would like to point out there were two questions.
Unfortunately, the speaker does not have a live microphone, so the interpreters cannot hear what he's saying and cannot interpret what he's saying. We don't even know what language he's saying it in.